Cliff, thanks so much for coming on. Really an honor to have you on the show to talk about your career, this book you've written, which we're going to get to. But you made it to become the chairman and CEO of Sonic.
Yep.
And I'd love to hear the background and story of what led you to that.
Well, it was a overnight success. It took about 20 years to get there, So, but as a lot of successes are. So it was a progressive process. My path, when I was a young adult, I really didn't anticipate going into business necessarily, but I had a view that I was kind of preparing myself to take any number of paths. My undergraduate studies were in history, and which I enjoyed then, and I still do. That's the primary thing I read, and which I think has broad application, but particularly just helps you with perspective about life. Whether it's in the moment or or thinking about your own over a broader period of time. That regardless. So I enjoyed history and wasn't really sure what I wanted to do. I didn't for a short period of time. I thought teaching might be interesting, but I didn't really go that path. I think teaching's more interesting when you're a student than it might be otherwise for most of us.
Yeah.
So I decided to go to law school, really because I thought it would give me a broad array of options, whether business, law practice, government, politics, whatever. It would open a number of avenues. I also decided I wanted to go to school in Washington, D.C. because that would be give me a deeper view of the law and history combined. And so I did apply to what was then kind of the three schools I considered in D.C., American, George Washington, Georgetown. Got into all three, and I considered Georgetown the stronger of the three, which I still believe that firmly. And so attended Georgetown Law and practiced law, private law practice for about 4 years. I was pursuing Sonic as a client, a potential client. A former neighbor of mine was an officer, and I had returned to this area of the country, that is Oklahoma City. My wife was born here, and I pretty much grew up here. My whole family was originally from Dallas, but I'd been here since, let's just say junior high school. And so the problem was, quote here, was in the middle of an oil bust in the early mid-'80s. And so from the time I returned here until that point in time, the economy had changed fundamentally and not for the better. So I was pursuing Sonic as a client, and they were clever. I had several visits with my friend, VP. Yeah, he brought me in. I was 29 years old. He brought me in to meet the new president, who was an old 36, And but I also thought, I say president, he was CEO. I also thought, well, they've got a new CEO. And my friend, the VP, told me that. He said, look, there's probably going to be more stuff happening here. We got a new guy, a younger guy. And so while I was pursuing them, they kind of turned tables and said, what we really want is we want you to come inside. And I thought, well, the economy challenging as it is here, new young president, things are going to happen differently. And so I left private law practice, joined the company as general counsel. I spent 8 years as general counsel, so that's my transition. I spent 8 years as general counsel, but really learned the business through that time. In that 8 years, took the company through one leverage buyout, and then 2 years later, a recapitalization, changing ownership, in which management came to own more of the company. And then finally an IPO in 91. And then when the company went public, after it went public in 91, I moved from general counsel to CFO for a short period of time. Told my boss, I'm approaching 40. Oh my God, I was approaching 40. And I told him, I think I'm going to go out and see what else the world has to offer. And he said, why don't you stay here and run the company? I'll make you COO. And I said, well, that's one of the things I thought I'd check out, see what the world has to offer. That's an interesting opportunity. So I stayed, took the job as chief operating officer, began kind of rebuilding some of the senior management team, so on. And a year and a half after he had made me COO, or after I had come into the COO position, he left rather abruptly. And at that same day that he left, the board made me CEO of the company. At that time, I'd been there 11 years, and had learned the business pretty well, I think, in at least how we made money and didn't make money. So they made me CEO in '95, and in 2000, I became chairman of the board. So it was a progression over time, and one that I kind of adapted to at points in time. But a fascinating experience. I was CEO for 23 years until it was acquired in December of 2018 by an affiliate of Rourke Capital. And by the way, that transition in '86, we bought the company for $10 million. When I took it over as CEO in '95, the value was $200 million, and we sold it for $2.3 billion. So
wow,
that was the progression over time. So I like those numbers.
So yeah, those numbers are incredible. And what's fascinating about your journey is you played like so many different roles within the company before becoming CEO and then chairman of. So you really understood the business. I have a few questions around like Sonic itself. How did you think about competition? How did you think about because you got the big players in the in like the fast food space. Which is like the McDonald's, the Burger Kings, the Wendy's, that type of thing. And Sonic has really managed to differentiate itself, particularly like during your tenure. How did you think about that?
Well, I thought about it less from the standpoint of the competition. I thought about it almost at all times on how could we strengthen ourselves, and really came to think about it, how could we strengthen our brand? Because when we bought the company in the 80s, we never talked about the brand. We talked about growing the business. And in the early 90s, after we went public, a guy named Bob Rosenberg came on our board, and Bob was then the CEO of Dunkin' Donuts. And Bob thought about brand all the time. One of his first board meetings, he let's say 92, 93, Bob asked at the board meeting, how do you think about your brand? And, my reaction was, what's a brand, So, so Bob really helped us start thinking about, any aspect of the business you're thinking about, the physicality of the drive-in, the way your television creative looks, the products you're promoting, the way your employees dress, all these things play into building an image in a consumer's brain that in essence is your brand, with the consumer. And so, boy, that caused us to start thinking and planning differently, and very interestingly so. I mean, it really was transformative for the business. So I thought not about McDonald's, anybody. We always thought about how can we grow Sonic? How can we strengthen the brand, grow the business, make our operators, which were primarily, it was 95% franchise chain. How can we make our operators more successful? And in the process, want them to grow with us and make the brand bigger, stronger, et cetera. So that really was the mentality, And I don't mean by that you could ignore your competitors, because you couldn't.
Right.
There are a lot of ways we had to respond to competitors. But our strategy for growing the business was focus within and become more intense, stronger about our brand.
So what are some of the things you did to, after that conversation, to strengthen the brand, or some of the things you implemented?
Well, I'm glad you asked that. So, one of the first things that happened after I became CEO, before I became CEO, I was COO. One of the things that we backed into, I didn't plan this. The franchisees saw in mid '90s that their license agreement, many of their license agreements were coming to an end, and a lot of our franchisees were, let's just say, in their 50s. Big slug of them that had come in their 30s in the 1970s. Okay, now they're in their 50s.
Mm-hmm.
They see license agreement coming to an end. They think, oh, we don't want, we got 15, 20-year mortgages. We can't have our license agreements ending, So they wanted to negotiate a new license agreement. And we had already kind of built the business and built their profitability nicely. So in 93, 94, so I had become COO. I was not yet CEO. 93, 94, we renegotiated a new license agreement. And to be transparent with you, we took like Wendy's license agreement and just said, what do they do? Because I kind of admired Wendy's,
Mm-hmm.
And we said, what do they do different from us? And so we went through and, trade dress requirements, marketing requirements, just, kind of went through and used it as a model. And what that said to me as I was COO was, look at what the franchisees and the franchisor had negotiated actually the year before I even joined the company. And look at the gaps between what Wendy's was trying to do and what our power permitted us or didn't permit us. And so it was a real learning experience. Anyway, when I became CEO, we were just initiating a process to kind of rebuild the brand. And a lot of it was about menu, a lot was about physicality, a lot was about employee uniforms. We didn't know where it would go, but we just started this process, 95 or so. We called it Sonic 2000, everybody was using that, but here's what happened as part of that process when we were working on the menu. And I talk about this in my book, okay? Because it was, I wouldn't call it serendipitous, but it was, you don't have to come up with all the ideas. I mean, somebody else got a good idea and it works for you, grab it. Don't.
Yeah.
This whole thing about not invented here is deadly, And so a franchisee came to me in 94 while I was still COO. And he said, you got to help me. This is a franchisee about a 30-store operator. You got to help me. So why? What's the problem? He said, you guys are going to hurt me. Tell me what do you mean? He said, well, I'm out here in the Carolinas and I'm doing better than the average store. But your two senior officers had come to him and said to him, you're promoting ice cream and that's not our deal. That's Dairy Queen. You shouldn't be trying to mimic Dairy Queen. And I said, well, what is your deal? And he kind of described it to me. And so here's my big question, trying to get a handle on what are we talking about here. I said, well, what does your top store do in terms of ice cream promotion? He said, you mean sales? I said, yeah, what are your sales at your top drive-in, ice cream wise? He said, 30%. And I almost fell off my chair. I mean, I couldn't believe what he said. And I said, don't change anything. Don't listen to those officers. I'm going to send a marketing person out there and you show them what you're doing. That was 94, the summer of 94. And we spent, I don't know what, 6 months kind of really refining what he was doing, but folded into our menu planning processes, And at that time, when you pulled into a stall at Sonic Drive-In, the menu you would see on the driver's side and the passenger side, those menus were identical. So in 95, we began testing some stuff where, food menu on the left, but then ice cream and drinks and so on, different, bigger on the right, more pictures, color, and it was all working real well. These tests were. We tested them in the winter in New Orleans and Houston and sold all kinds of ice cream. And we thought if we can sell ice cream in the winter in Houston, we can sell ice cream anywhere in the summertime, So in the spring of 96, we rolled out what we called, and they still call, frozen and fountain favorites, Sonic's frozen and fountain favorites. And we put the menus up across the system in April. I'd been CEO literally a year at that time. Sales were okay. It was no big deal. And in May, we came out with media behind it, behind the frozen and fountain favorites. And in the month of May, I mean, I could tell you, May 1996, in the month of May,
Mm-hmm.
comps were 12%. Sales at the average store were up 12%. And of course, you
Unbelievable.
knew we got something going on here. What I didn't really realize was it really changed the way people could use our brand, use our business, because they'd been using it primarily at lunch and dinner. And what the drinks and ice cream program gave them was a reason to come in more in the afternoon and in the evening. So now suddenly we were leveraging our labor better. And suddenly we're leveraging this fixed asset, the building, better, and our equipment and everything else. But the bigger thing that happened was the first full 12 months, our fiscal year, in which I guess it was really calendar year 96. So calendar 97 for the average operator across the Sonic system, profits, not sales, profits at the average store went up by 40%. And so
Wow.
the average operator, it was just like suddenly just money falling on them. And so some of the groaning and so on that occurred because of this license renewal, all that groaning stopped, And what did happen, we were part of it going through this brand renewal process. Menus, physicality, products, consistency and quality of products coming in the back door, uniforms, and so on. And what started happening then, this was calendar 97, these guys were making so much more money that when we said, this is what we want the retrofit to look like, they just seized on it because their average store profitability, gave them tons of cash. I mean, the timing was perfect. And so here, this kind of, 40-year-old brand, and much of the system was 20 years old, never really had a lot of deferred maintenance. Suddenly in 98, 99, 2000, the entire system got retrofitted with this new look. So what do you have? You have better and more consistent products coming in the back door because we required that in the license agreement in terms of purchasing. I also brought in a new talent to oversee that area. So the purchasing really took a big step up in terms of quality, but also consistency. And
Right.
then the promotional activity, drinks and ice cream. So people using us 4 day parts, lunch, afternoon, dinner, and evening, lunch, afternoon, dinner, and evening. And so profits up at the store level. Now in a 3-year period, the whole system is retrofitted. That system, it had taken Sonic 44 years from 1953 to 97. It had taken us 44 years to hit 1 billion in sales. In the next 4 years, we doubled. From 97 to 01,
Unbelievable.
we went from 1 billion to 2 billion in system-wide sales. I mean, that, now you want to ask me, am I partial to ice cream? Oh, I love ice cream, you might say I have a sweet spot, for ice cream, but that transformed the business. And, again, jumping forward, 01, we had 2 billion. When we sold the company in 2018, the system-wide sales were 4.5 billion. So we continued to grow, not at the same pace, a little difficult to pull that off. But so that series of initiatives, the whole Sonic 2000, the physicality, the new menu, what was on the menu, how we promoted the menu, so the way the drive-ins look, but suddenly now this bursting advertising. Because if you're doing in 97, let's just say maybe 3% of sales in advertising, we probably weren't. We're probably doing 2.5. So let's say in 97 we did 25 million in advertising. By 01 we weren't quite at 4%. Let's say 3.5. You go from 25 million in a certain number of states to something on the order of 70 million in advertising 4 years later. So, I mean, everybody's seeing your brand a lot more, seeing it on advertising, seeing it, here and there, and then so that's kind of the first big stage. Now we kept growing from there in terms of other methodology. So I don't want to run on here too long. We had not the number one thing, no, two of the things we hadn't done from a marketing standpoint by then that the next few years, took off. One was our use of national cable, which we were only beginning. And two was the Two Guys campaign. Those came later.
Yeah.
But we hit the 2 billion with a world of momentum in '01, and the business really had been transformed. And so it was at that time that the board said, we'll make you chairman of the board. So that was a point.
I want to ask you about the campaign, but as you talk about, really pivoting into advertising the ice cream and the drinks, when I think of Sonic, I think of your ice. How did you figure out the ice?
Well, I'd like to tell you that was my second big idea, but that wouldn't be true. The ice really was something that our founder had put in place years before with a vendor relationship, and it was widely loved. That pellet ice in the styrofoam cups, and people could nurse that drink. I mean, if you're driving around, going on a trip, whatever, you can nurse that drink for hours. And so I'd like to claim credit for that, but I can't. So that was our founder, Troy Smith. That was one of his numerous brilliant, innovations.
How did you make sure that all of your franchisees kept the consistency and the quality of the brand?
Yeah, good question.
That seems like that would be a really difficult.
Yeah, you might say, like a lot of things in life, you might say a carrot and a stick, but the carrot always had to be, a meaningful carrot, And so before that license conversion process in 94, 95, there was a lot of inconsistency in the system. I mean, literally in the same town, you could pull into two Sonics and their menus would be different. And they might even buy from different vendors. And they might have different size hamburger patties on their hamburgers, literally. So I think the thing that made that was one, we went through that license agreement process that required it. You going from no requirement to going from a general requirement about specifications to a requirement, you will buy off of national contracts approved by the franchisor. You will participate with an agency of record chosen by the franchisor. You will, so on and so forth. I mean, it was really just state-of-the-art franchising stuff, but it had not been in place for the company. Now, you could say, was that difficult politically? Initially, yes. But I told you a moment ago about the system going from $1 billion in 97 to $2 billion in '01. Because they had not all been buying off of a single contract. When we started requiring that in 95, 96, and then blew out the profitability, we were buying, in some cases, better product on a national basis. But because it was a national contract or a system-wide contract, they were able to get better products at a lower price. And so what was the carrot? The carrot was that from that same 97 to '01 timeframe, profit margins improved at the average store by 500 basis points, meaning 5 percentage points.
Wow.
In other words, just that. I mean, there was 5% going to profit that there had not been in 96, 97. Now, do the math. 5 incremental percentage points of improvement in profit on $2 billion in sales. I mean, you're talking about $100 million in profits in these independent operators' hands that had not existed just a few years before. So it doesn't take a very big stick when you got that.
Yeah, when it's that obvious and you're seeing those types of results, I imagine it doesn't take too much of a stick. Let me ask you this, because you brought up something that I find pretty interesting. That's like the advantages and disadvantages of the franchise model. You said before that about 95% of all the Sonics were owned by franchisees. What are the advantages? What are the disadvantages to that model?
Well, the beauty of franchising is you can build a brand on a national basis in terms of the single characteristics that are identifying from a customer standpoint, at least on a remote basis. But you take the piece that is most critical in terms of customer interaction, and that is the restaurant itself in the case of restaurant franchising, but the customer experience. You take that and you have the potential anyway to put it in the hands with franchising, in the hands of a local operator. And maybe they don't live in the community. Oftentimes, an individual franchisee does live in the community in which they're operating, and it's really fantastic from that standpoint, because what you get is a small business operator with the economic advantages of big business, i.e., you get to buy off a national contract, you get to advertise on a national contract, but you operate and you hire your employees locally, and you know your customers. So to me, in its most pure form, that's the ideal of franchising. Now, you do have a potential consistency issue, and that really goes back to, from my standpoint, what's the philosophy and culture of the franchisor in dealing with franchisees, as well as what's the power under the license agreement, as well as then what's your practice then for requiring that level of consistency. And you do have to have that approach. It doesn't have to be heavy-handed or mean. The question is, how do you build the brand? And if you have a high level of inconsistency, you're going to undermine your brand. So that doesn't mean you don't have some testing and so on, but you need to work with individual operators to know what the testing is and make sure it's handled right and marketed right and so on. So franchising is its own business. I think people that have a business and say, "Oh, we're going to franchise because it's easy money," that's the wrong approach. It is a different approach to growing a business, and you're using other people's capital, i.e., the local franchisee. But when you do that, you have to manage the relationship with the individual franchisee, but you also have to be very clear about, and in contract, in philosophy, and in practice, you have to be very clear about what's expected, from a consumer experience standpoint. And it's not, doing whatever the hell you want because you're an independent franchisee, So I hope that answers your question. That's my perspective.
Yeah, I think franchising is such an interesting innovation, right? And who came up with franchising? Do you know?
Well, I don't know the answer to that. It began growing more heavily as part of the U.S. economy post-World War II. If you think back about the Howard Johnsons and the Holiday Inns and so on, the hotels were one of the early spots. Although there was some food service with it, some of the early Marriott stuff was food court sort of stuff. Anyway, those were that was the nature of the expansion post World War II. My suspicion is that our interstate highway system really caused it to go to another level altogether, because people traveling cross country more enjoyed seeing brands that they were accustomed to and favorable toward. And then just with the evolution of it, it's a huge part of our economy, But the thing I love about
it's enormous.
The thing I love about it is that it is a way for a person who wants to operate a small business to lower the risk considerably, because they do get to, one, step into a business model that's been shown to work elsewhere. Two, get to buy off purchasing contracts that lower the cost. And then three, depending upon the circumstance, leverage off of broader, within a market, within a state, across country, whatever, marketing programs. Because the average operator can be excellent at operations, but they're not a marketing person necessarily, So
right.
So I think
was it Ray Kroc who?
Yeah, did McDonald's.
Was it Ray Kroc who really kind of showed that it was great from a fast food perspective?
Well, perhaps so. he might have. As I think back about that, who was before McDonald's? Well, A&W was before
Right.
McDonald's.
Yeah.
I'd have to think about who else, but
Yeah.
there were a few. What he did, of course, was just take it to a level of success that outstripped anybody else.
Yeah.
So
Speaking of your brand, and you mentioned this, the two guys in the car, which is probably one of the most successful advertising campaigns that I can remember over the past decade or more. So, how did you think about your national commercials? How did you come up with that idea?
well, the what was going on early, just after the turn of the century. If you go back and look at what people were buying into, cable was growing. And at that time, initially, cable was all about the local franchise who was granted it, and then you could kind of watch, specialty programs sort of stuff. So things started getting a little splintered, and in terms of viewership, and so you say what was working at the time that was getting more sensational viewership. And if you recall, sometime back around 2000, I forget exactly when, one of the programs that just flat took off was, "Do you want to be a millionaire?"
Right.
And I mean, it was like all of a sudden. I mean, the thing was popular, and then because it was popular, it wasn't once a week. It was like on every night.
Yeah.
And so you say, well, what's going on? Well, it's authentic, I mean, it's right there. It's live and it's sensational, and whatever was going to happen right then. So one of the things that occurred to us, and our agency, Barkley, was the agency that put the thing together. One of the things that occurred to us was, what is attracting people more than anything else is something live, something more spontaneous. And our hunch was something that had a sense of, I hate to use the term, sounds worse than I intend for it to sound, of voyeurism, where you can kind of see inside, And so our initial thought, and the way we started with this thing, was the two guys would travel around to competitor stores with a hidden camera, and ask questions. And it's got some great stuff, hidden stuff. Like going through a drive-through window and asking for a certain product, and the employee would say, "You'll have to go to Sonic to get that." And we're like, "Wham! Thank you." So that's what we did initially. But one, it was physically challenging for them to do that, and two. So for every however much time put in, you only got so many commercials, et cetera. And I say that to say, once we started filming on lot, it was unbelievable. They'd film for 3 days and they'd come up with months of commercials, just right there. And so it was enormously efficient. Just get them to change clothes, change products, and, to keep going, on the filming. At any rate, how we came up with it was trying that, and it seemed to help, seemed to break through. It did coincide with us beginning to move advertising to more cable. That was very difficult with our operators. They were very controlling about their local co-op expenditures, because we did marketing by co-op, which was the television market. And so that's another story unto itself. But they did come to a point, because of an experience we had, where we coincidentally, and that's a great story, we coincidentally got some cable advertising nationally. And all these guys saw our brand on a NASCAR race one weekend. And they came in and they said,
Really?
They said, "How can we get more of that?" And we said, "Well, we're spending 3 points total, 3%. Let's take a half point and put it into a fund, we just called it that, a fund that will buy, system-wide rights to cable. And they were, yeah. So we started doing college football and so on. And of course, it was like a drug, because it had a big impact on sales, and people loved. They've been seeing their local commercials for years, but now they're seeing it on college football, and Southeast Conference.
Yeah.
And so that was a nice play, because we took it from 0.5% to 1%, and they started stepping up their local expenditures to the point that in 2004, I think we took it to 2% on cable and 2% local. So this helped a lot, because it started getting a lot more advertising out there. So here we were bringing on the two guys and refining that whole thing at the same time that our marketing expenditures were growing. We hit $3 billion in sales in 2005, and I think we were probably doing 4% in marketing. So that means by 2005 we had grown from, in 97, let's say 25 million in marketing. 2005, 3% of 4% 3 billion, 120 million in marketing. So we've gone up almost 5 times in that 8 years in terms of the amount of marketing. So all of this, yes, how did you get the momentum? Okay, with the retrofit in the late 90s, and then, the new products, and then the new ad campaign, and now getting the word out just a whole lot more, 02, 3, 4, with the shift to cable. And so these things, they all feed on themselves, I can keep talking, because there were a couple of things that happened in there.
Oh, yeah, it's super valuable.
Okay, well, here's one of the things in that same time frame. So now we're going out more cable, and now we're getting, our reach is much better with advertising. The franchisees are making so much money, they're opening more stores. And the two guys, they're coming on, they're real popular. Let's just say 01, I went to a program for CEOs in Chicago, sponsored by, I think, Nation's Restaurant News and Visa. And it was a small conference, and Nation's Restaurant News wanted to do interview, and they'd publish this in their magazine. It was a pretty cost-efficient way for them to get everybody in one room, ask a bunch of questions, and they end up doing 12 pieces from it in their magazine, So halfway through the day, we had to listen to a Visa commercial, and it was a live person standing there. She says, I'm going to say this to you, you're going to say, duh. But mind you, this was 20 years ago, okay?
Yeah.
And she says, restaurants that accept credit cards are more than twice as likely to get mom to stop on the way home from work to grab food for dinner as a restaurant that doesn't accept credit cards. Okay, well, 20 years later, it's like, but, it was a different time,
Sure.
And so I left there thinking, well, we accept credit cards. And then I thought, and this too today, it sounds horrible, but I thought, but wait a minute. Yeah, we accept credit cards, and you have to hand your credit card over to a car hawk to take it inside, run it, and bring it back. So here we are doing 5% of our sales in credit cards, 95% in cash. So I thought, well,
really?
No wonder people don't want to use a credit card. They got to turn loose of it, But in fact, what we had was a younger population coming on that used credit cards all the time, but they just weren't the primary buyers at that point, meaning 20 years ago. My kid, both my sons are in their 30s. So 20 years ago, they were early teens. They weren't using credit cards, but now that's all they do. They don't carry cash, Anyway,
yeah.
So what seemed to be the solution? Well, the solution was the way you get gas. You pull up and you have to pay at the pump, and you don't have to go inside. It's enormously convenient. You're there and you're gone. And so I thought, well, heck, we got the counterpart in every parking stall. And so it was a little bit more arduous than this. But the point is, I got our guide in our tech group to build that attachment that he could literally stick onto the menu housing. So when you pulled into the stall, if you want to pay by credit card, you could use the you could pay at the pump. You could do it.
Yeah.
You didn't have to turn loose your card. You could pay for it, and boom. And so we did that, and two things happened. One, our average check at that time was $5. When people use a credit card, the average check was $7. So
really?
a 40% increase in average ticket size when we made that credit card reader available at the stall. What else happened? The franchisees, the payback was so fast on this thing that we thought we were going to have to force it on people. People, can we put it in at every other stall? Can we do this and such? And the answer was, it was rolled out across the whole system in 18 months, and the payback was enormous. I told you a few minutes ago, at the time I went to Chicago to listen to that thing, I told you in 01, that was when I went, 01, our system-wide sales hit $2 billion, and 5% of that was credit cards, 5%. That means 100 million was credit cards. Is that right? Yeah, that's right. 100 million was credit cards. 1.9 billion was cash. Okay. 17 years later, we sold the company. System-wide sales were 2.5 billion. Cash at that point was 2 billion, and credit cards were 2.5 billion in sales. So virtually 100% of the incremental sales over the next 17 years were credit cards. So that's
incredible.
That was a total gimme, I mean, that was the service stations were already using it, but the convenience, for the customer, the safety, and then the ease for the operator not having to make cash, change, et cetera, less pilferage, less stealing of cash.
Right.
No reason to come up with a short change box, Anyway, so that was a big impact, very positive impact, quiet, easy for the operator, great return on investment. So anyway.
Before we go, I got to ask you about your book called Master of None,
Yes.
and it's how a jack of all trades can still reach the top. I'm fascinated by this idea of you don't really have to be a master of any one particular thing, but really good at a lot of things. What led you to write the book, and tell us more about that?
Well, I felt like, as hopefully your listener would feel today, I felt like I had a lot of great stories to tell about the growth of the business. Some of these about the ice cream and about the credit card reader and these things, and the two guys, some of these things I talk about in the book. So if your listener likes that, then they should enjoy the book as well. But so one, I felt like there are a number of good stories to tell. Two, I would say that what I really did offer to our system was less about, what kind of ice cream and what kind of burger and so on. But I think what I did offer to our system for 23 years as CEO was good leadership and help them move in a direction that transformed a lot of people's lives. And I know that. I mean, I'm telling you, I know it, 20 years later, because they tell me so, and because I see their lives are different, So I know I provided effective leadership, and so Master of None does speak to the idea that I didn't necessarily master any single topic, but I did lead the system on a path that really transformed the brand, transformed a lot of people's lives. By the way, the book makes the point. The jack of all trades, master of none, comes out of the mouth of a guy named Robert Greene, who made the comment about a writer for whom he had no respect. He says the guy is a jack of all trades, a master of none. Well, that guy, you've never heard of Robert Greene. I'd never heard of Robert Greene. The guy he was commenting about was William Shakespeare.
Oh,
so
yeah,
that's where
just the greatest writer of all time.
Right. So that's where this comes from in our vernacular, master of none, jack of all trades. So the book does relay a lot of those stories. And I think ultimately it is about leadership, but I didn't come at my leadership with the view of, I know all, because I didn't, So it is about leadership and how to engage in effective leadership, I believe.
Yeah, and for those who want to read it, go to cliffordhudson.com. It's also, I imagine it's everywhere books are sold, right?
You bet.
It's called Master of None, How a Jack of All Trades Can Still Reach the Top.
And it's also out in audio form. If you're driving and you want to listen to it rather than read it, you can download it in that form. And if you didn't like hearing my voice today, you're really going to have a hard time with that book. But otherwise, it is me reading my own book, which was kind of a fun experience in itself.
Well, Cliff, thanks so much for joining us today on the show, sharing your story. Man, I could talk to you forever, particularly about the franchise model and really the way you led Sonic into just a juggernaut. So thank you so much for coming on, and maybe we'll talk again soon.
Good. I'll look forward to it. Thank you very much.